mine, Stephen Anthony Orzel, who's a college math professor, and today we will be discussing the meaning of sacred geometry and the history of the Pythagorean mystery schools. And we'll be asking such questions as, how did Plato and the Neoplatonists reveal the sacred sciences of the Pythagoreans through their writings? We'll also talk about the sacred sciences of harmonics, how sacred geometry manifests in the physical world, and how we can use sacred geometry to enter Plato's world of ideas. We'll also be sharing with you specific meditations which will be given so you can begin activating your spiritual awarenesses, and we'll be looking at wave particle structures and how geometry can flip around into the time field and become a wave. So, with that being said, Stephen, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm so excited to be doing videos again, and this is something really important that we're doing here, and I'm just really happy to get started with all this.
Excellent, and I'm very pleased that you decided to do the show, and I know we had discussed this for a while, and I know you're quite busy with the other work that you do, but let's get down to it. Here's a question for you that everyone's just itching to ask. What is sacred geometry?
Well, there's a couple different ways of looking at what is meant by sacred geometry. Really, I can identify three different perspectives on answering that question. Number one is a kind of symbolic approach where we view sacred geometry in terms of religious symbolism and some of the world's great architecture, the Gothic cathedrals, the Greek temples, the Parthenon, for example, and even going all the way back to the Egyptian pyramids and other sacred sites like that. And when we understand the mathematical principles that have been encoded into those buildings and great works of art like in Da Vinci and so forth, we find that the mathematics that goes into that is something that we call sacred because it connects our mind to these primal archetypal laws that govern all of creation. So that's the symbolic approach. There's also a kind of energetic approach where we view sacred geometry as the knowledge of a kind of vibrational physics that leads to all sorts of things with being able to control and transmute energy fields through the laws of sacred geometry and how different energies manifest out of specific geometrical forms. And through this study, we understand that there's laws governing what types of vibrational energies come out of different geometrical forms. And so what this is called is shape-caused waves, and we find that different things like pyramids have specific energies that are directed in certain fields of energy that surround these pyramids and that emanate in well-ordered ways governed by the laws of sacred geometry. The third approach is something that is not really my area, but when you hear some people talk about sacred geometry, this is what I can identify as what they're doing, is they're kind of doing a kind of mathematical physics, not with traditional mathematical physics, which views the mathematical models in terms of Newton's laws of motion, Einstein's theories of relativity, and quantum field theory. There's another mathematical approach to this kind of physics that uses sacred geometry, and it is valid. It's just that getting into the physics there is something that's not really my field. Really, I'm interested in the first two aspects, and that's what I really enjoy talking about.
Fascinating, fascinating. Yeah, I mean, there's many interesting concepts you talked about there with Newtonian physics, and as you go into geometry and more of its complexities, most certainly you can see how a wavelength would have a connection into sacred geometry and how these things are always creating. But can we get into a little bit about the Pythagorean traditions?
Okay, so the Pythagorean tradition in sacred geometry really goes back to Pythagoras, who was a Greek who lived in the 6th century BC. He was actually born in Greece, but moved later to southern Italy, where he founded his mystery school. And so in Pythagoras' early days, he traveled all around the Mediterranean world to receive teachings from all of the great masters of the world at that time. And it's related in the Life of Pythagoras by Iamblichus that Pythagoras studied for 22 years in Egypt, studying with the Egyptian hierophants and priests, learning all the knowledge of the laws of harmonics that were encoded into the pyramids and the symbolic aspects that the Egyptians knew that allowed them to take their mind into these higher geometrical realities. So it really begins with Pythagoras himself. And after he traveled the world getting all the teachings that he possibly could, he founded a mystery school in southern Italy. And the nature of this mystery school is quite impressive. Is actually what we could identify as the first secret society in Western civilization. And it's really the kind of model for things we find later with the Masons and the Rosicrucians. Really all goes back to Pythagoras. So what was going on in this Pythagorean mystery school is there were various levels of initiation that a person who wanted to receive teachings from Pythagoras had to go through various trials and had to be tested to see that they were worthy enough to receive the teachings. So what was specific about this is that there were two levels, and the outer level, they were called the acoustici, which means the hearers. They were the people who could listen, but they were not allowed to speak. And they had to swear an oath of silence for 5 years before they could speak in this school. Once they got through the 5 years, they were not allowed in just yet. They had to go through more tests and trials to finally be allowed into the inner circle of the Pythagorean school. And so this is basically Pythagoras himself. And the inner circle of this school, these people were called the mathematici. And this is where we get our word mathematicians. And so in the ancient times, they didn't have an open public teaching of mathematics the way we do today. It was something that you had to be initiated and go through all these ordeals in order to receive teaching in mathematics. Now, it was the mathematics that they were learning was of a bit slightly different nature than what we have today in our schools, because their intention was a kind of mystical, magical pursuit that had knowledge of how to elevate consciousness, how to control and manipulate energy fields through the laws of sacred geometry. Now, as far as Pythagoras himself, what we get in history books is this kind of mathematician who discovered the Pythagorean theorem, and sometimes you hear things about Pythagoras discovering the laws of harmonics, which give us the diatonic scale in music.
Right.
And the interesting thing, though, when you read the Neoplatonic biographies of Pythagoras, what we get is not someone who was a mathematician or a philosopher. What we get is someone who was like a god. He was a miracle worker. He could perform miraculous healings with music. He was able to read people's karmic history, where he could remind people of who they were in their previous lifetimes. So this is definitely a different picture than what we get in our mainstream education of Pythagoras. So this school was actually they did things that were kind of outside the mainstream, and they kept things secret. And anytime you have secrecy, it always brings people from the outside to suspicion of that they might be trying to do something politically to kind of overthrow the powers that be. So there was actually an attack on the Pythagorean school in the time of Pythagoras. There was a mob that kind of may have burned the school down or something like that. It's not real clear what we get in the histories. So this school kind of scattered. Pythagoras is not, we don't really know where and when he actually died. So these teachings kind of scatter, and this creates a kind of secret lineage that trickles down through Greek history. And when we come to Plato, is actually 7 generations after Pythagoras himself. And Plato is definitely part of this tradition. It's called the Golden Chain. Plato is, of course, the most famous philosopher in Western history. And Plato today is probably the most famous for works such as the Republic. And we hear of Plato as kind of this political philosopher, but that is definitely not the truth of Plato. Plato was definitely in this Pythagorean tradition. He had received Pythagorean instruction from a teacher and eventually wrote these Pythagorean doctrines into his dialogues. The most famous Pythagorean-centric dialogue would be the Timaeus, where Plato describes the creation of the world soul through harmonic musical proportions and describes the construction of the elements through the what are called the Platonic solids. And we can talk about those later. But definitely what we find in Plato's writings is a kind of concealed presentation of Platonic doctrines so that they would be preserved through history, but that not everyone would be able to read them. You kind of had to be initiated into the tradition in order to really read Plato in the right way.
Now, I wanted to ask you just a quick question, and I want to stay on the Pythagoreans for a second here before we go any further, because I know we're moving into Plato right now. And for Plato, I guess from what I've seen, Plato is not only known for his being tapped into the mystery schools, and he knew about Atlantis. He's pretty much our source on Atlantis. He has a monopoly on it. But looking back into the Pythagoreans for a second, one thing I wanted to ask you was, first of all, is there a connection between the Pythagoreans and Leonardo da Vinci?
Oh, absolutely. What is actually going on in the Renaissance period in history is these Pythagorean Platonic doctrines are kind of resurging through the rediscovery of Plato's writings himself through the Medicis, getting these books out of the Islamic sanctuaries where Plato had been sort of stored and sort of forgotten by Western history. And what's going on in the intermediate period, sort of between the 6th century and the probably 13th century, is, this is when Christianity kind of takes over and becomes the official religion and kind of blots out paganism. And what happens then is, then paganism kind of goes away, Christianity takes over, and then we see the wars between Christianity and Islam for the next however many centuries until we get to the Renaissance itself, which is kind of the resurgence of this lost ancient Greek knowledge, beginning with the rediscovery of Plato's writings and the rediscovery of the Hermetic corpus.
Because it's interesting too. There's so much of this that's trickled down, probably through, as you mentioned earlier, with the Rosicrucians and everyone, grasping onto this knowledge. And again, going back into the laws of harmonics that you did mention, I just wanted to quickly throw this in, is that again, modern physics and what we are looking at nowadays, they are grasping many of the theories of these great thinkers, and they are now becoming mainstream science because, of course, when we look at the laws of harmonics and how they're in relation to the chromatic scale of music and how an atom works, we start to see in the dimensional ecology that now the laws of harmonics are now common knowledge, and they've now been adapted to what we're looking at now. So again, I would beg to ask the question, how did this guy know what he knew? Obviously there were some amazing perceptions that he had, or do you have any theories on how this information was coming to him, or was he just a great thinker?
It was definitely in ancient tradition, ancient knowledge of the builders, as it's called, and this is not the Masons. This is the knowledge of the construction of the pyramids and
Right.
how the Greek temples were built and things like that. So this knowledge was definitely there, but kept in these priestly hieratic orders where this stuff was kept completely secret and never written down. It was an oral tradition probably for centuries, if not millennia, before it actually gets put in the form where Pythagoras taught it in his mystery school that later goes down to the writings of Plato.
Right. So getting back to what you were talking about as you were going on about Plato, I didn't mean to cut you off in there. If you'll just go on, I mean, that was absolutely fascinating, and how there seems to be this sequential aspect of these individuals that are working side by side. This knowledge just keeps getting passed on, even though there's efforts to stop it, right?
Yeah, so kind of after Plato, we do have Aristotle was Plato's student, and Aristotle is seen to be at odds with Plato in modern scholarship, but the Neoplatonists did not think this way. The Neoplatonists actually put forth a lot of effort to harmonize Plato and Aristotle. So Aristotle was definitely part of the Golden Chain. He just didn't necessarily write so much mathematics that we can easily identify Aristotle as being part of that. But modern mathematical logic is really just Aristotelian logic. So after that, we find Euclid of Alexandria. Euclid was famous for writing the first massive textbook of geometry called the Elements. And the Elements consist of 13 books. And in these books, he begins from the very rudiments of geometry, defining a point, defining a line, and all the things, a circle. And this is kind of what we get today in high school algebra, is kind of the same material as what's in Euclid's Elements, although they don't use
all the high school kids out there, they have Euclid to thank for all their homework.
More or less, although it's what we get in schools today is a kind of degraded version of this, where we don't see the metaphysical aspects to it anymore, and it's more just like for practical calculations in terms of things people can use, and they've really taken all of the sort of inner development aspects to geometry out of the picture. And it's been a great tragedy that we've really lost that perspective in mathematical education. So anyway, after Euclid, we find the Neoplatonic tradition, and this is really not until about the 3rd century AD, beginning with Plotinus, who also went to Egypt to get teachings, but then later on went to Rome, I believe, to do a lot of his main teaching. And Plotinus is sort of famous for presenting a kind of mystical approach to Plato. When you read Plato's dialogues themselves, they just sound like, dialogues between Socrates asking questions like, what is justice, what is piety, what is beauty, what is the form of the good, and all these sort of things. We don't really know how to interpret Plato quite yet. Plotinus is famous for giving Plato a mystical interpretation where he says that the highest form in Plato's world of forms is something called the good, which is the same as the one. And the one is basically what we think of as God, but keeping in line with the Pythagorean mathematical concepts here, they wanted to think of God as not really a number, but the principle of numbers. And oneness is how they thought of God. So this is what Plotinus strove to do, was interpret Plato in a kind of metaphysical, mystical point of view. After Plotinus, we come to Iamblichus, who really goes back and puts the Pythagorean doctrines into Plotinus, and also pulls in the Chaldean oracles and emphasizes something called theurgy, which is what we get today, is kind of like ritual magic, ceremonial magic. It's the same thing, but it's really the kind of what's the word? Like the Eleusinian mysteries and the Greek mysteries. They would perform these hieratic rites to the gods. They were performing theurgy as what they thought of as a state of mind that was above mental contemplation. Plotinus did not emphasize theurgy. He felt that we could attain to the highest levels through contemplation alone. But after Plotinus, we get to Iamblichus, who says that no, we need something more than contemplation. We need theurgy, which is a ritual act of union with the gods. After Iamblichus, we come to Proclus, who was known as the successor. And Proclus ran a reincarnation of Plato's Academy in Athens throughout the 5th century. And Proclus was a massively prolific writer. He wrote commentaries on nearly all of Plato's dialogues, most of which are lost, but a lot of the important ones survive, and we can read those today in English translation. Proclus is most famous for writing a book called The Elements of Theology, and this book was consciously modeled after the pattern of Euclid's Elements. And Proclus begins with the highest metaphysical principles, which basically is an understanding between the one and the many. And from there, we understand the chain of causation. From the highest level is the one, and then we get to being, intellect, soul, and body. And Proclus describes how all these come about as cause and effect relationships. And in 211 propositions, written similarly to Euclid's Elements in a kind of geometric style, he begins with the one, derives all the levels of being, and finally gets to the level of human souls incarnating in physical bodies as the very last proposition. And all these propositions will depend on each other and built up in a logical structure of thought, just like Euclid's Elements. So this book was actually massively influential on Christian theology for quite a while, although Proclus was later dismissed and denigrated as a pagan, to use a kind of derogative sense of that word. Although when we really understand Proclus, he was not anti-Christian whatsoever. He was merely trying to preserve the golden chain of the Pythagorean teachings. Now, Proclus also wrote a commentary on Euclid's Elements. He wrote a commentary on Plato's Timaeus and also the Parmenides, which he's famous for. And that's sort of Proclus's main famous works. But Proclus was also a theurgist. He wrote hymns to the gods. He practiced his religion devoutly. And he ran the school in Athens for 50 years. And so his life was very productive, very prolific. But for the most part, Proclus has been forgotten to history. And it's been a great tragedy that many of Proclus's works have been lost to history. Although he is being studied much, much more lately, he's still not seen as important as he should be. So for the most part in academic philosophy, Proclus is not read, he's not studied, although he's the only systematic philosopher of late antiquity. And he's pretty much the sort of the capstone on the Neoplatonic movement, and is kind of the last of the great philosophers of antiquity. There are Neoplatonists who come after Proclus, but he's definitely the most famous. And kind of after Proclus, the golden chain kind of dies out with the hegemony of Christianity, and only, as I said, later comes back as the Renaissance that we have, starting with Da Vinci and Kepler and so forth.
So we have these great pioneers, and for the most part, Proclus being a theurgist, he sounds like we have a lot of dedication that comes in there for that sort of Hermeticism, and I'm willing to bet in the Christian period, and we get in these areas where there's this great prosecutions and everything is being kind of torn up and thrown all over the place. It's interesting how this wisdom is preserved. I mean, we've seen throughout history the great library of Alexandria burned down, but I have a theory. I don't think that those areas were actually burned, and a lot of these great libraries were actually destroyed. I think that the information just was taken away, and the those who were the elites or the mystery schools were able to get some of that information and take off with it. I mean, that's just what I think on that level. But this leads us to the next area. Okay, we have these great pioneers. We have the people in history, the ancient peoples that throughout antiquity and the areas that you've been discussing. But then we get to the Quadrivium, the numbers, the geometry, the harmonics, the cosmology. Where does this all fit into the picture of what they brought out?
So the Quadrivium is the way the Pythagoreans broke their doctrines into fourfold categories. And it really begins with looking at this. We can look at quantities, and we can look at magnitudes. Quantities are things like where we have collections of objects, is really what we have today in mathematics as integers. And then magnitudes are things like lengths and volumes, things like that. We think of today as real numbers. And so the way the Pi looked at it was that magnitude can be continued through infinite expansion, and magnitude can be divided through infinite division. With that said, quantity and magnitude can both be broken down into two subcategories. When we look at quantity in itself, that is absolute quantity, that's what we have as numbers or arithmetic. And then looking at quantity in relationship is what we have as harmonics or music or proportion. On the other hand, we also have magnitudes that can be broken down into either magnitudes at rest or magnitudes in motion. Magnitude at rest is what we have as geometry, and magnitudes in motion is what we have as cosmology or astronomy. Okay, so that's the fourfold breakdown of all mathematical science according to the Pythagoreans. And our current mathematics education has gone so far astray from this original setup that the Pythagoreans used that a lot of what my work intends to do is to kind of rekindle the flame of the Quadrivium-based education and try to get that going again in our schools and colleges.
Fascinating. You know, I got to say this. Maybe if we went back to the education that was intended for us with mathematics by looking at the Pythagoreans and start to look at these different categories of the quadrivium of how to learn, perhaps most people wouldn't struggle with mathematics. I'm not saying everyone struggles with mathematics, but it sounds like there's a way to make it so it's a little easier to understand, or to allow it to open up into the wider areas it was intended for. Because most certainly, as we can see, as you and I have been discussing here, you know, geometry is found within everything, and so is mathematics. But what does number symbolism mean to these areas?
Well, the difference that I see, first of all, between Pythagorean mathematics and today's mathematics, at least as far as what's happening in our schools, is that our schools don't really care so much about empowering the individual, as the students would gain a kind of spiritual self-knowledge through their studies of mathematics. That really the only emphasis is on whether or not it's useful. And from my spiritual perspective, that this is actually very dangerous, because it has us focus on material things as being really all there is, and kind of ignoring the subjective feeling level of the students who would experience a kind of self-knowledge, or a kind of higher awareness of themselves through understanding how when we work on mathematics, there's something active in our soul, that what the Platonists would have said about this is that the mathematical forms are eternal archetypes that exist in our soul, and that when we do mathematics is a kind of projection from the intellect onto the level of the soul through kind of the window of the imagination, that we can kind of see these geometrical forms being projected onto our imagination. And when we understand it from this level, we understand there's something active internally with studying mathematics, that we've gotten so far away from this internal self-awareness perspective, and only emphasizing either usefulness in terms of technology, or just outright not really caring about anything other than getting as many theorems published as you can to try and build a reputation for yourself, whether or not that has any significance to the overall scheme of things. So getting into number symbolism, the Pythagoreans didn't have their ideas of numbers as what we currently have today. To them, numbers were more qualities and kind of metaphysical entities than things that we do for counting and keeping track of things. So it really begins with understanding that they didn't have the numbers 1, 2, and 3 the way we do today. They called them by different names to distinguish them from just counting. So the number 1, in terms of its quality, is called the monad. And what they had in mind with this is ideas like beginning, unity, individuality. The number 2 as a quality they called the dyad, and that gives us ideas like duplication, reflection, polarity, and opposition. The number 3 they called the triad, and this gives us ideas like growth, multiplication, expansion. And the number 4 is called the tetrad, which they thought of as kind of symbolizing stability, order, regularity, and structure. Now, when we add up all the numbers from 1 to 10, or sorry, from 1 through 4, we get the number 10, which they called the decad. And they symbolize this through a symbol called the tetractys, which has 10 dots shown in the form of a triangle, that when we understand the tetractys, it actually encodes some of the deepest secrets of creation and the structure of the universe as a harmonic living being. So this number symbolism is crucial for understanding geometric symbolism that's going to come later through looking at sacred geometry, things such as the Vesica Pisces, the Flower of Life, Metatron's Cube, and how all these geometries have numbers encoded into them, that when we know how to read the geometries through their number symbolism, we get sort of a story that's told by these familiar sacred geometries.
I think it's absolutely fascinating because, especially when you look at an application for mathematics on a spiritual level, it brings back the old question, did we discover math or did we invent it? You have to look back and forth with this. It opens up the universal acceptance and universal language of mathematics. If I look at how the mathematics have been interpreted in the esoteric sciences, if you look at the I Ching, or you even look at the tarot, they incorporate the different numbers in their spiritual sort of meanings, or even if you look in numerology, or if on the Hebrew side of things, you look at gematria. These numbers have such universal qualities. Like 1 is always that creative number, if you want to go back to the monad. 2 is the number of partnerships. The Druids called 3 the number of completion. So it's fascinating how that comes together. I really want to ask you the next question then. I mean, we've gone over the symbols, the number symbolism, the symbology there. What about the geometric symbolism? Because, man, this could be huge, because everything in our world relates to some kind of geometry. The human body relates to some geometries, I'm sure, that you could tell us about. It's endless.
Yeah, and once we get to geometric symbolism, what we see there is this kind of higher dimensional language that we want to understand it as a kind of sacred text that can be interpreted to kind of take our mind to a higher kind of dimensional reality. So it really begins by understanding the point and the line. So the point is kind of the geometric symbol of the monad, and the line is the geometric symbol of the dyad. And the Pythagoreans looked at it as this, that you had the one as sort of like God, but then the first emanation from the Godhead is the primal causes of the limit and the unlimited. And what Proclus called these is, in Greek, would be peras and apeiron. That's the limit and the unlimited. So first of all, the point is the limit, because any geometrical figure we have, just consider a triangle, the corners of that geometrical figure are points, and they're the limits that surround and enclose the figure. And a line is corresponding to the archetypal cause of the unlimited, because once we start drawing a line, it can be continued off to infinity, and that corresponds to the unlimited. So in geometry, everything comes from the point and the line. And the same type of metaphysics in the Platonists is everything coming from the limit and the unlimited. Now, there's so much we could do just meditating on the point, and how geometrical figures can be broken down in terms of dimensionality. There's an interesting thing when you look at a point, though, because like I said, it kind of corresponds to the monad, because we have a point as like one thing, but Euclid defined a point to be that which has no parts. So he's defining a point by negations only. And in sort of mystical writings, they always say that the primal causes are only understood through negations. And so when we get to the Kabbalah, we hear things about Ein Sof, the infinite, which is sort of what we think of as nothing, but not really nothing as a pure nothingness, but really as the source of all things that will come out of that into manifestation. So before we have manifestation, we have this nothingness. And we think of it as this sort of infinite emptiness. But as soon as creation begins, it always has to begin at a point. And anytime you're drawing a geometrical figure, you always begin at a point. But what's there before you have that first primal point? There's nothing. You start with a blank page. And this is so mystical if we would only look at it in the correct way. So once we have a point, that point can expand to create a line. And that's the dyad, is this kind of expansion and extension. What we get next is the triangle. If we then took this line and connected it upwards to another point, that would give us a triangle, which is now a two-dimensional surface. So what we're seeing here is a kind of dimensional movement as we proceed from the monad to the dyad to the triad. But really, when we look at dimensions, the point is zero-dimensional, and a line is one-dimensional, and a triangle is three-dimensional. When we get to the tetrad, which is kind of like the number 4, we get to a geometrical solid, which is really three-dimensional. So when we understand how the numbers give us these dimensional progressions, we see there's this mystical understanding. Once we understand it, we can kind of harmonize our consciousness with how all of creation works, because all of creation proceeds from a primal nothingness to a point of beginning, and then to an expansion of that beginning, where this expansion kind of comes back together and then sort of develops into three-dimensional space from there. So this is the sort of the beginning point of geometrical symbolism, is understanding dimensional progression as being a kind of progression of numbers. So there's the next type of geometry is called the circle. And the way a circle works is you have a center point, and it's the set of all points that rotate around that central point. So what's going on in the circle is a kind of wholeness. And, you know, we have all these points on the circle and then the point in the center. And again, the point in the center is transcendental. It has no extension into space, but it's sort of this anchor point that all of the points on the circle are in reference to. So as far as you know, first looking at the circle, we can think of it as this kind of wholeness, but also as a kind of fullness. And it is true when we later look at sacred geometry in terms of energy and vibrational energy. What we find with the circle is that it actually manifests two very kind of very special types of energies. The whole circle itself gives me the full spectrum of all possible energies, and the point in the center gives me a type of energy quality that has the function of producing balance and harmony in all energy systems. And there's a lot we could say about that, but let me just relate that at this point while we're talking about the circle. So we can also look at the square as a geometrical symbol, and kind of tied into the tetrad and the number 4, tied into ideas about order and structure and stability and things like that. So there was an ancient problem called squaring the circle, and what was meant by squaring the circle was to be able to construct with ruler and compass a circle that had the same circumference as the perimeter of a square. And why the ancients were so interested in this problem is they thought of the circle as kind of symbolizing the heavens. When we think of the sun, we see this giant circle out in the sky radiating light and warmth. And down here on the earth, we have materiality and physical things, which is kind of symbolized by the square. So what is meant by squaring the circle is literally bringing heaven down to earth. And this is what all the ancient builders' traditions were talking about in their geometrical forms. They were talking about squaring the circle, bringing heaven down to earth to manifest the heavenly order here on earth. And this is what they were trying to do with building these temples. The great Gothic cathedrals, the great Greek temples, even going further back to the pyramids. What was being done here was to create on the earth these perfect archetypal geometries that corresponded to living thought forms in the mind of God, that when these geometries are then manifested in this world, then that can harmonize and sort of bridge the gap between the physical world and the spiritual world. So that is really the symbol of squaring the circle, probably the most important geometrical symbol in sacred geometry is squaring the circle.
Very interesting. And I also want to point out, which is rather remarkable, is that, if you've ever looked at the studies done by Dr. Rick Strassman, who he did some studies on something known as dimethyltryptamine, DMT, on people's pineal gland, and it was actually a full-blown medical study. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, and where he was administrating it to people. What they found is that not only is DMT something that gets released every night when we dream, and it's flooded into people's brains when they die. However, when these people were administered this natural substance that we have flowing throughout us, one of the number one things that they would witness out of their incredible visions and the things that were coming to them are complex geometrical shapes and patterns on how they would interpret an outside world around this. That one could even say, in his hypothesis, that this was the spirit molecule having a nexus there in the sacred geometry. Furthermore, I also want to look at the importance of geometrical symbolism inside of religions and traditions, as you pointed out. I mean, we've had the cross in Christianity, which also is a symbol that goes back further than that. In Catholicism, they're drawing the lines across them to get back to the line as well, and drawing from a point. Where the circle has most certainly been used. Not only do we look at Copernicus's stuff, but I mean, look how the circle is used within the traditions of if you want to look into magic or even witchcraft, on how a circle is drawn around people, and even if you look at how to look at the curvature of space, even in physics, and how this is brought in. It's interesting when you talk about drawing down heaven onto earth with the squaring a circle and whatnot. Could you go into really quickly the geometric symbolism here of not only the human body as a whole, but geometry that's found around us? Could you go into the 5 points and how that works for our listeners?
Yeah, so as far as understanding the language of nature, what we find when we investigate different plant forms and different crystal forms is they all have these laws of geometrical proportion encoded into them. And even our own body is mainly designed after what's called the golden ratio, or the phi ratio. And if we look at things like the ratio of the wrist to the forearm, then that follows a golden ratio proportion, or different all sorts of different proportions of the human body are almost exactly the golden ratio. And this is exactly what we find in things like plant growth. Actually, the golden ratio comes out of what's called the Fibonacci series, which is what we take when we start with 0 and 1, of course, because everything begins with 0 and 1. So if we take 0 plus 1, that gives me 1. And then I take 1 plus 1 is 2. 1 plus 2 is 3. 2 plus 3 is 5. 3 plus 5 is 8. 5 plus 8 is 13. 8 plus 13 is 21. And I continue on that way by adding the two previous numbers to get to the next one. And what happens when I take ratios of Fibonacci numbers, in the limit, this will converge to the golden ratio. And that's sort of how it comes about, as just starting with this unfoldment process through numbers that gives us sort of this law of growth that leads to this proportion, which is found all through nature, is found in the human body. And I'm sure there's just more and more ways waiting to be discovered of finding the golden ratio. I'm sure people are working in the sacred geometry of physics will find the golden ratio all over the place as well.
Getting back to what you were talking about, the application of mathematics and geometry in these areas and bringing back a new way of learning with the quadrivium, it's interesting because theoretical physics seem to be doing that lately and sparking interest in mathematics in almost a spiritual sense with people outside of that materialism as you were bringing in, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And that brings me to the next area to ask you about, really about geometric energy. Can we talk about vibrational physics?
Well, a good actual lead-in to discussing vibrational physics would be some things what you said about the casting of a circle in some sort of magical ceremony. And the purpose of doing this is, like I said, that actually the energetic properties of a circle is that the circle itself gives you the full spectrum of all vibrational energies. And the point in the center gives you a balancing, harmonizing energy effect, so that anytime a magical ceremony is to begin, you always have to understand that when you're drawing this circle, you're basically saying that you have access to the whole universe. You have access to the all, and you're at the center, and you're balanced in that center. So before you begin, you need to get to that point of balance. What we also find is how people will draw things like pentagrams, and there's an energetic effect from drawing pentagrams. It has to do with the number 5. And it's interesting that when you actually draw a pentagram, it will manifest the golden ratio, because the proportions of the sides in a pentagram fall in the exact golden ratio proportion. So basically, the energetic effect of drawing this 5-sided shape is that it has the energy quality of protection. And so before any type of working would begin, a person would want to have the space protected and sort of sealed off from any negative influences that may want to interfere with that type of meditation. So this is ancient knowledge that is not fully understood, but there is today a kind of emerging science coming back with understanding the energies that are related to geometric forms. It's a kind of vibrational physics, and they describe it as shape-caused waves. And like I said, you look at something like a pyramid, and you can test the energies coming off of a pyramid using what's called vibrational dowsing, which is different from mental dowsing or psychic dowsing that people do today, where they ask a mental question and program the pendulum to give a response, usually yes or no questions. But vibrational dowsing is totally different, because what you're doing is directly testing the energetic emanations from geometrical forms using appropriately designed dowsing instruments and pendulums. So what this science has discovered is a breakdown of the full spectrum of all possible energies into what are called the 12 bands of energy qualities. And it's interesting how it works, because actually 7 of the 12 bands are in resonance with ordinary colors, with going red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Those are the 7 visible colors in the vibrational spectrum. But vibrational physics has also discovered there are 5 invisible energy qualities that correspond to infrared and black, going below red, and then also ultraviolet and white, going sort of above or beyond violet. And then the 12th energy quality is this mysterious energy quality that these French researchers who began the study of vibrational physics called negative green. And it's kind of an awkward name because it's not like it's negative in the sense of being bad. And it really isn't green. The reason they called it negative green is it's actually the polar opposite to green on the circle. So what we would find on a circle is that the energy quality green would be at one point, but then opposite to that would be this energy quality called negative green. And how negative green works is we understand it to be the spiritual carrier wave. And what is meant by a carrier wave is sort of like when you're listening to your radio, say you've got your radio tuned to FM station 101.9. That means that the carrier wave of that station is 101.9 megahertz, but the actual vibrational frequency of 101.9 megahertz is not the music that's being broadcast over that carrier wave. The music is riding on the carrier wave as the actual sound frequencies, but is not the carrier wave itself. The carrier wave is only what transmits the energy and information from one place to another. And there's an analogous energy quality in vibrational physics called negative green, which is understood to be the spiritual carrier wave. And what the French researchers discovered was that negative green has the shortest wavelength out of any vibration that we have discovered so far. And it was known to actually penetrate through thicknesses of lead that X-rays could not penetrate through. But I should say something about vibrational physics, that this is not something that a electronic device or something similar could detect, that we have to use a pendulum and use the pendulum as sort of like an extension of our nervous system, because these energies are affecting us as on sort of an etheric life energy level and not on a material physical level. So there is a distinction there, and it's currently a kind of underground science because to convince mainstream science that the only way of detecting these energies is through dowsing with pendulums, they don't want to hear anything about that, because they are not going to be able to, publish so much results in a similar way where they can, basically report the results of some scientific instrument that did the reading. They don't want to write some academic paper and say, well, here's this research that I did with energy, but my findings are all based on me holding out a pendulum and dowsing out energies, because other people would look at that and say, well, that's not science what you're doing. That's a bunch of superstition, because science should be done where the scientist does not interact with his experiments. But that's still a ridiculous notion, because what we have in quantum physics today, quantum physicists understand that a scientist is always affecting his experiments with his consciousness, shown through the famous double slit experiment, which many of you are familiar with. And if not, you can Google that and you'll find great information about it. So this vibrational physics has resulted in a kind of restoration of the ancient knowledge of the pyramids and what the pyramids were used for. Obviously, we know that they were not used as tombs. That's a ridiculous notion. Why would they build these massive structures just to bury themselves in? We look at that from our own modern egotistical perspective, but that is not what the ancients wanted to be doing with those. Basically, they wanted to create a massive geometrical emanator that would manifest harmonious energies throughout the whole country. And when we understand that the pyramids were aligned to not specific stars, but actually points in space near stars, like, for example, Sirius and Orion's Belt, the constellation Draco, what we find is that the pyramid shafts were not aligned specifically to the stars themselves, but in the areas of space near those constellations, because there are energy qualities emanating through space, these type of vibrational energies, that by creating the pyramid shafts aligned to these locations in space, and when you look through them, they're not pointing to stars, they're just pointing to black areas in the sky, because there are these invisible vibrational energies that they wanted to kind of harness and kind of bring those into the pyramid. Now, how a pyramid works is, first of all, the overall shape of it is going to give you the full spectrum going around it. And not only that, is it emanates a strong carrier wave of negative green down the top. And when the harmonious balancing energies are coming in from space through the pyramid shafts, you're having the full spectrum coming around the base and the carrier wave coming down the top. That's emanating all that beneficial vibrational energy to all the people of Egypt. And not only that, but there were aquifers underneath the pyramids so that this energy would be projected down into the water streams, so that when the people drank the water, they would actually receive a kind of healing and rejuvenating effect from this. So how this science is used is when we understand the energetic effects of geometrical forms, then we can use geometry as a kind of programming language to engineer a vibrational effect into a space that can be used to, either in a room or a house or something similar. There's really no limit to the size, but then these type of energies can be programmed. If we wanted to have a certain effect of energy into a space, then we would use what we know about shape-caused waves and which geometries create which energies, and build those geometries into the space, and then those energies would emanate through the space, creating the effect that we had intended. So we can use this for things like charging up our food and water, so that when we put those in our bodies, we get the beneficial effect from the energy as well. And there's an advanced science that's being developed that we can talk more about, but basically that is what's going on with this, that we view this as a kind of programming language to engineer a vibrational field that can be used in ways that we want.
I absolutely agree with you. David Wilcock has actually pointed out that many of these viruses that we have out there have their own geometrical structure, which is a wave particle structure, and the geometry can flip around into the time field and become a wave. And if everything in our universe is being created by a wavelength that's creating DNA, and then DNA is evolving from an outside source, then Mother Earth seems to have this sort of living force that's moving around, that's able to have these instructions and sort of like, just like you said, a programming language, right? The geometrical programming language, which is fascinating, which shows that there is these pre-programmed sort of instructions that come with all these geometrical shapes, and that leads me to thinking, I mean, already there must be some sort of frequencies and sounds and colors and areas that can be correlated with not only the numerology systems, but if you even look at the music of the spheres that is out there. I also want to bring up something with you really quickly, and I've mentioned this on another show because I absolutely love this. I do follow Michio Kaku's work and Penrose's work and everyone's work. In there, it's quite interesting. We get another concept of geometry, so to speak, I want to ask you about. It talks about the Wilkinson's microwave anisotropy probe, which is taking a microwave radioactive background scan of the universe, and we get that going on. And what we actually find in the background scan of the universe is that it's the shape of basically a dodecahedron. And Do you and I had a previous conversation about this in one of our talks. This isn't something new, is it? I mean, science is confirming this now, but who else knew about this, and how long ago was it that they knew of it?
Well, what's going on with this is that in Plato's Timaeus, he gives a correspondence between the Platonic solids and the elements. And how it works is I actually have models of the Platonic solids with me.
Really? Can we
So
see them?
Plato, yeah, they're pretty cool. So first of all, we've got here,
Cool.
this is a tetrahedron, and it corresponds to fire. And we don't think of it as, as something actually on fire or burning. We think of it as like a energy quality that's sharp and hot. Now, when we look at this, this form, we think of sharpness as being, look how sharp these points are here. And I've colored it in red because of the correspondence to fire. We also have here, this would be an octahedron. If I can kind of turn it around and rotate, we can kind of see it there from different angles. The octahedron corresponds to air, because if we look at this as kind of how nicely it moves through space through these directions, it kind of has this breezy quality to it. So when they talk about elements, fire, water, air, and earth, they're really talking about energetic qualities and not physical elements the way we have the periodic table of elements today. So modern physics will dismiss the Pythagorean and Platonic physics that appears in the Timaeus because they think it's ridiculous that they only had 4 elements, fire, water, air, and earth, when we know we have the whole periodic table of elements today. But they were definitely not talking about physical elements. They were mainly talking about a kind of energetic or metaphysical elements. So also, if we can go through the rest here, the icosahedron is
Cool.
corresponding to water, and that's why I've drawn it in blue. Here is a cube, and it corresponds to the element of earth. So when we look at this, we see a kind of stability here. So that's why it's the element of earth. Now, what you said with the dodecahedron is this guy right here. Absolutely beautiful.
It's beautiful.
So what we have on the dodecahedron is 12 pentagonal faces. And the dodecahedron doesn't correspond to any of the elements. And in Plato's Timaeus, where he gives this correspondence, this corresponded to the universe, which is absolutely fascinating that modern physics is describing the shape of the universe as a dodecahedron.
It is.
Because the question is, how did Plato know this in the first place? And
Yeah.
what my hypothesis is that through a kind of metaphysical exploration, you might even say a kind of out-of-body experience, they were able to make their consciousness as big as the universe. And this is what they experienced. And when they came back, they knew this from a first-hand experience, not through any kind of scientific testing, but from actually going there and experiencing it as a reality. And then they came back and gave us the teaching that we have in the Timaeus. So it's absolutely fascinating, to have modern physics discovering this today. It's really incredible.
It definitely is. Do you want to tell us, getting back to the Quadrivium and some areas you were talking about earlier about you were going to bring out a new type of education on mathematics. You were going to bring the spiritual components out. Can you tell our listeners about mathematical meditations that you've developed and visualization exercises, how they can get started with working with the Platonic solids and the Merkaba field and things like that?
Yeah, so what I would like to do with my work is to kind of teach people the principles of sacred geometry and how we can use this as a kind of spiritual path or a kind of system of self-initiation where we can expand and develop our consciousness to a higher level so we can actually achieve existence in Plato's world of ideas. Now, in basic Platonic metaphysics is that there's a distinction between real beings and beings that aren't really real in the way we think of it. And so in the Timaeus, Plato asks the question, which is this: what is that which is becoming and is never real? And what is that which is always real but is never becoming? And what they're talking about here is a distinction between an archetypal idea which doesn't have a physical material associated with it, and then the actual material world. And the distinction is this, that if we draw a circle on paper, eventually that physical paper will disintegrate, but the idea of the circle will remain forever. So we think of these geometrical forms as really sort of like doorways or gateways that we sort of pass through to get into this world of ideas. So when I'm actually, holding up this dodecahedron here, this is not really a dodecahedron. It's only something that our mind can latch onto to get to the real archetypal dodecahedron. Because if you look close at what I've drawn or what I've constructed here, there's slight imperfections. I cut these out of paper and glued them together, and they're not totally perfect. So this is not the real dodecahedron, but it does suggest the actual dodecahedron, which exists eternally in the mind of God, and that is the Platonic form. And what we need, I think, in our education is to understand this distinction, because our society has become overly materialistic in everything that we do. So in order to get back to a kind of spiritual awareness, if we had our education in mathematics emphasizing the Platonic forms of the geometries, then that would show us that there's a distinction between the physical world and the spiritual world. And what I want to do in my teaching is to have my mathematics lessons emphasizing these points, and to give people different kind of exercises where they can relate their inner feelings to the geometrical, basically construction process, like actually building the Platonic solids. And there's something that happens when you do this. There's a kind of initiation that occurs when you're constructing geometries, because what happens is something wakes up in your consciousness that was sort of dormant and sleeping, that when you build these geometries, something wakes up inside of you. And it's basically an awareness of these pure archetypal patterns that when we follow this work, what we find is that we are really reading the thought forms in the mind of God, and that the longer we continue to do this, the more we resonate with the mind of God, and the more our mind actually becomes like the mind of God. So there's a kind of geometrical theurgy, you might say, where theurgy really means a kind of union with the gods through work and activity. So what's going on is that, in the Timaeus, they describe, how the Platonic solids are created. So when we go through the creation process ourselves, we're really reenacting that creation process that God went through in creating the archetypal patterns that result in the physical forms we see in the world. So there's meditations we can do that are more powerful ways of linking these geometries into our consciousness. So one thing we can do is visualizations of the Platonic solids. One that we can start with, of course, is well, we could just start with this, the octahedron, because this is probably the easiest to visualize. Now, if you see what I've got here, if I kind of turn it around, it's really just two pyramids kind of stacked one on top of the other. Okay, now if I think of putting myself at the center of this and kind of projecting a line upwards and then projecting a line downwards, and then I'm going to go forwards and backwards, and then I'm going to go left and right to get these 6 vertices on the octahedron that define the 6 directions of space. And so what I do in a meditation is I would kind of get comfortable and close my eyes, and I would visualize light being projected upwards, downwards, forward, back, left, and right. Then what I would do is connect these points with the different lines, and that's going to draw an octahedron around my body. And when I'm in the center of that, that's going to attune me to this type of centering and balancing energy quality. Not only that, but the octahedron itself, there's some of the laws of sacred geometry where if you count that I have here 6 of these vertices, the corner points, I have 8 of the triangular faces. So when you look at this, you see each of the faces is a triangle, okay, and that there are 12 edges. Then when we go to the cube, what we find is this is what's called the dual of the octahedron, because now when I count faces, I see 6 faces. When I count vertices, I count 8 vertices, and there are also 12 edges. Okay, so these two solids here are dual to each other, because if I kind of place an octahedron within a cube, I'll see that the vertices of the octahedron correspond to the faces of the cube, and that the vertices of the cube correspond to the faces of the octahedron. Okay, so what we can do in our meditation is once we've visualized the octahedron around us, there's a kind of transformational process that occurs where the octahedron can be transformed then into a cube, and they can either be compressed inwards and shrink down to a point, or expand outwards to infinity. Okay, so the same thing happens with the icosahedron and the dodecahedron. These are also dual to each other, where if I interchange the vertices and faces of both of these, I can place one perfectly inside the other. So similar to what I just said before, I would visualize myself as sort of sitting in the center of the icosahedron. And once I have that form stabilized by visualizing it, then I could have it be transformed into a dodecahedron. So there are natural laws of geometry that then translate into a kind of meditational process to attune us to these transformational processes. The only one I haven't mentioned is the tetrahedron. Now the tetrahedron is self-dual, because if I was to place another small tetrahedron with the vertices of the small one at the centers of these faces, here, here, and here, with 4 of them, what I would find is there's another tetrahedron sitting inside these. So the tetrahedron is self-dual. So there's all sorts of things you can do through meditating on the numerical patterns of the Platonic solids and how the geometries transform into each other that you can resonate with in your meditations by doing these visualizations. And at a higher level, once you kind of do these visualizations for long enough, what you'll find is there's kind of crystallization of the astral and etheric forces, that it doesn't take you long to redo the visualizations. So let's say like with me, for example, I, for some reason or another, I have no explanation for it, but my feet get cold during the winter. I have no idea why. It's just some oddball thing. But with having cold feet, one of the things I do as a remedy is I take and visualize a tetrahedron on my feet. And what I do is I visualize it spinning around like this, okay? And then I visualize it spinning faster and faster and faster, and I can actually feel the etheric forces, a kind of heat building up when that happens. And so there's going to be a similar effect when you work with the other Platonic solids as well.
That's very cool. I like that a lot. I like how you were able to implement that. The I would suspect that, using and harnessing the power of the sacred geometry and the symbolism behind them can start unlocking many things in a person's life. So I got to say this, Stephen, are there any last words you'd like to leave everybody today on, on what we talked about today, or just about your work in general?
Well, as far as what my work intends to do is to kind of remind people that the true mathematics of the original people who called themselves mathematicians, going back to Pythagoras, they were interested in doing this to kind of develop their consciousness, to become aware of the eternal forms, and to gain a kind of self-knowledge through doing that. And when this happens, there's a kind of understanding of a distinction between what is eternal and lasts forever and what is going to eventually decay and pass away. And so when we come to this understanding, we really understand who we are as spiritual beings, which, this is what I'm basically saying, that there's so many people today exploring spiritual paths of different meditations and different teachings and doctrines. But I would say that the highest quality spiritual teachings and techniques are going to come from looking at sacred geometry. And everything that I've been describing today is really just the entry point into how a person can follow a spiritual path of self-initiation to awaken their higher self, to know what is eternal versus what is perishable, and to kind of attune ourselves to these archetypal forms that we find all around us in nature, because we understand that the physical world was constructed by these archetypal laws. So then we understand that the physical world is not an accident that science tells us. We're not here because of random chance. There's meaning and purpose to everything that we do. And that is the message that I want everyone to take from this conversation, is basically that. Know yourself internally. Know what is eternal versus what is perishable. And understand that all around you in nature is meaning and purpose, and you are part of that meaning and purpose.
Fabulous. It's interesting, too, because the Russians now have something known as the theory of everything, where they claim to have calculated and been able to calculate where every single photon is going to end up. And so when you look at that, is that not only everything has purpose and how everything is coming together in a sequential sort of event, it's amazing. I have to say, thank you so much for joining us today. What you were able to give to us, the information you shared was fabulous. It was remarkable. I got to ask you this. I ask everybody that has been coming on with us so far. Can we see you again? Will you join us again?
Oh, absolutely. I'll be super excited to do this again with you.
Fabulous. And I got to say that not only can people find you at Stephen Anthony Orzel .blogspot.com, and we're going to have a link at the bottom of today's video as well for those of you who want to look, and we'll have it also up on the screen right now at the bottom. But we also have the Via Mathesis blog, viamathesis.blogspot.com, and of course your YouTube channel, which is at www.youtube.com/user/Via Mathesis. Be sure to add Stephen into your YouTube subscriptions and to start following him, because he's got some fabulous things. And thank you so much. You have yourself a wonderful evening.
Thank you.